Welcome to UFO Sundays at UFO Denmark. My name is Astrid. Today we have a guest on the show who is a true expert in one of the most complex UFO incidents ever, an incident also known as the British Roswell. Our guest has done a lot of research on this incident for many years now and has just released a book about it titled Non-Human, the Rendlesham Forest UFO Incidents, 42 Years of Denial, which include new information about the incident not previously published. You might have guessed where we're heading. Yes, we are going to Rendlesham Forest with Gary Heseltine. Gary is a retired police detective, has organized several UFO conferences, publishes the UFO Truth magazine, and is also the vice president of ISA, International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research. A very warm welcome to you, Gary, and thank you for joining us today.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Before we dive into the Rendlesham Forest with you, could you please tell us a bit about what got you into this UFO matter in the first place? Was it the Rendlesham Forest incident?
Well, my interest in the subject of UFOs began as a child at 16. I had my own childhood sighting. Nothing in terms of a spaceship or alien bodies or anything like that. Or I'm not an experiencer, but I basically saw a bright white light that seemed to trigger a number of power cuts in the area where I lived. And I moved to a second geographical position about 3/4 of a mile away. And as daft as it sounds, I was able to predict within the second or so that once the object had passed over my home, and having moved about 3/4 of a mile, that object, the whole area was plunged into darkness. And I figured that object, whatever it was, had some kind of interaction with the power grid, because it's ridiculous. How could I predict a power cut? So that's where my interest began. We're talking 1976, a long time ago, just before the video cassette era. And the only thing that I could really do then was to go to my local secondhand bookshop. And I remember, of all the books that I could have got, the first book that I got turned out to be something of a synchronistic moment, because it was by Major Donald Kehoe, who was the founder of NICAP, who very famously wrote 5 books. And I bought my first UFO book, was the last of his 5 books, Aliens from Space. And I got a validation moment almost straight away, because it talked about the New York blackout in 1965. And it's rumored to have been triggered by UFOs affecting the power grid. So straight away, I got some kind of a validation moment, which kind of set me on a path. I was interested, I got books, but that's literally all I could do. I then kind of went away for a long time. I joined the Air Force. I had 2 children. I then joined the police. And it really wasn't until about 1996, 97 that I suddenly came across a glossy UFO magazine, called UFO Magazine, which was the late publication by Quest Publications, run by Graham Birdsall, who sadly died a long time ago now. And he was something of a mentor a couple of years before he died in 2003. And he got me really interested. It kind of reawakened my interest through reading the magazine. And I got new books that I'd kind of not realized were out there. I read those, and then I felt a growing frustration of, I want to get involved in some capacity, but it was difficult. As a detective constable, your time is not really your own. If something serious happens, you work for long periods. You can't be one of these people that just says, well, I'll be there every Thursday. It doesn't work like that. So I kind of pondered how I can get involved in research. And then I remember people saying to me, write about things that you know. Well, what I knew was police officers. So basically, I then came up with the idea for the Proof Force Police Database, police reporting UFOs. And I approached Graham Birdsall, the editor of UFO Magazine, and said, look, I've had this idea. Would you support me and allow me to write an article? And he said, yeah, it's a great idea. Cut a long story short, in January 2002, I went public, I launched the database, and almost immediately, within weeks, I was getting retired officers' accounts of UFO sightings in the UK, and that steadily increased. And one of the things that I didn't anticipate was the fact that people started to ask me to give talks around the UK. Now, I'd never done a lecture in my life, and I was turning up and there'd be 150, 200 people there. But fortunately, I took to it a bit like a duck to water. It just seemed very natural to me. And I knew some of my colleagues, because I was still in the police at that time, would have run a mile to be in front of a camera or to be in front of a large crowd, for any length of time. But for me, it just came naturally, and I don't know where it comes from, but I'm glad I have that ability, I guess, because that's how I became known. And now here we are, 2023. I'm celebrating my 21st year as an active researcher.
Mm-hmm. So, when did you start researching for your book?
For Rendlesham?
Yeah, yes.
Well, indirectly, I never planned to write a book. It was never something I envisaged I would ever do. Although I guess in back of my mind, I'd thought about writing a UFO book. But I didn't intend to write the book that I have now written, Non-Human. Basically, my public research into Rendlesham began when I got involved with Colonel Holt of Rendlesham fame, who wrote the Holt Memorandum for a documentary called UFO Hunters. If you remember that with Bill Burns, the series ran, an American series ran for 3 years, I think, on the History Channel. And it was in the first series. And they'd contacted me and said, look, we're coming over to the UK. Could we film you about your police cases? And I said, okay. And then I said, what else are you coming over to the UK to film? And they went, oh, we're going to do Rendlesham Forest. And I said, well, I've got a real interest in that. And they said, why? And I said, well, I used to be in the Royal Air Force Police, and for 3 of my 6 years service, I guarded tactical nuclear weapons and did pretty much exactly the same job as the US Air Force police officers involved in Rendlesham. And I said, I've got some questions for Colonel Holt. And they said, oh, great, come down. So that's how I got involved. And that was my first TV appearance, as it were. And if you still watch that episode, I'm in that, and I'm talking to Holt, and we go up to the top of the tower. And one of the things that's not shown in the actual TV production is that it was my suggestion to go to the weapons storage area, it was my suggestion to film from the top of the tower, which is a bit rickety these days because nobody really goes up there. But Colonel Holt and I went up first. And whilst the film crew was still talking at the bottom, I just had a chance to ask him and film him on my own video recorder about something he'd already told me. And basically what he told me is he said that the person in the tower on one of the nights of the UFO activity had contacted him and said, there were definite beams coming down into the nuclear weapons storage area, and that security police personnel on the ground also saw the beams. And I thought, well, I'll just take that video. So he repeated that, basically what I've just said to you, verbatim. And that little clip has been out on the UFO Truth magazine YouTube page since 2013. And it's on there because it's unequivocal from Colonel Holt that there were at least 3 witnesses in the weapons storage area who saw a UFO shiner beam down directly, but we didn't have any names. And we'll come back to that, but that's in a sense where I went public with my interest in the case and my background in working with nuclear weapons. And basically, I was doing private research. And then in 2017, I was asked to get involved in a new documentary called Capel Green, which you'll be aware of. And originally, it was only going to be basically about Larry Warren's account, which was this controversial account of him saying that there was another landing, that he'd witnessed entities, that it was surrounded by security police officers, that Colonel Williams was there, the base commander, and that it was being filmed, big things. And he'd written a book, Left at Eastgate, with Peter Robbins, which had been a bestseller at that time. And I was asked to be the lead researcher. And I then said, well, okay, if I'm going to get involved in this project as the lead researcher, I'm not the lead researcher now, I've dropped out of the project, but if I am going to be that lead researcher, then I need to be accurate in what I'm saying and supplying for the film. And so basically what I did was I said to myself, okay, I'm going to start from day one after the incident, so beginning of 1981, basically, and see and do a deep dive into whatever I could find. And now I thought that I knew the case pretty well because of my previous interest in the case. But when I did that really deep dive, I came across, some really old interviews that I wasn't aware of with witnesses that had been done by other researchers. And I found a lot of new material. But what it also did was, because of my advanced interviewing, I was an advanced interviewer in the police for suspects and witnesses. I decided that sometimes where I felt that a witness may be able to give more information if they're questioned in a slightly different way, that they might give more information. So I tried that approach and went back to a number of military witnesses, and I did actually get a lot more material, in particular with two witnesses, one called Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, uh, who who basically corroborated the Larry Warren account, that this so-called controversial account that Holt, Jim Pennison, and John Burroughs had said basically didn't happen, especially Colonel Holt. Now, Sergeant Adrian Bustinza said to me, and it was all audio recorded over a 4.5 hour transatlantic phone call, that basically it did happen. That Colonel Williams was there. There was a second landing. A craft was seen on the ground, a shimmering craft. It was surrounded by US Air Force security police officers, and that it was being filmed, and that he had seen kind of entities himself, or silhouettes as he described them. He found it very uncomfortable to talk about occupants, for want of a better word. And so that was, really interesting. And then I spoke with a guy called Steve Longero, who was an airman at the time. He'd arrived at the base just a couple of days after Larry Warren had arrived on the base. We're talking sort of early December 1980, so just in the days before. And he'd been on the same training course at Lackland Air Force Base with Larry Warren. They were part of an intake of maybe 45, 46 airmen, and doing the security training. And whilst they weren't friends as such, they knew of each other because they'd gone through the same training process. And it's like when I joined, I was in a class of 47 on my intake, and you do all your basic training together, and you know everybody's name, but you quickly forget them, and you really only pal up with the people who are in your dormitories. For usually pal up with 4 or 5 who are just in your block where you sleep, basically, and they become good mates for that course. But Steve Longero, as it turns out to be, a very evidential person in himself, a 30-year Air Force and law enforcement career, as was Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, who had basically 35 years plus law enforcement and Air Force career. And, really two stand-up guys. And on both occasions, I did transatlantic phone calls. Like I say, Adrian Bustinza was 4.5 hours, and Steve Longero, I think, was about 3.5 hours. But they gave me extraordinary information, a lot of which was new, which is contained in this book, and Non-Human, and had never been seen before. Steve Longero had already been interviewed once briefly by a UK researcher called Philip Mantle. But when I read the short interview, I got the impression that Longero knew more. So I managed to get the details from Philip Mantle, and I went back to Steve Longero and said, would you try concentrating for me? And, I want to try this kind of advanced technique on you. And he said, yeah, okay. And he provided some extraordinary information that hadn't come through his interview with Mantle. Not least being the fact that Steve Longero said, and going back to what I said earlier, Steve Longero was actually one of the people, those security people on the ground in the nuclear weapons storage area, walking around when a UFO shone a beam down. Now, up until that time, it had always been rumors, but in reality, he was now saying, "I'm a direct witness," and I saw it. So for me to get a direct witness, a first person record, as it were, in a statement form, to go on the record was really important. But what he also said that was really interesting, that's in the book, totally nobody was aware of this, is that he had once he'd had his sighting in the nuclear weapons storage area, he'd been walking around with a senior airman. It may have been a sergeant, but he was probably a senior airman inside because he was just new on shift. And he basically had was just there supernumerary. He was just new on shift, so he wasn't experienced. So he was being shadowed basically by an experienced airman. But when the UFO stopped showing the beam down into the nuclear weapons bunkers, it then went off in the direction of Rendlesham Forest, and he was then removed as a spare kind of person from the nuclear weapons site, which wouldn't ordinarily happen. And he was sent with lots of other airmen into Rendlesham Forest. And he then goes on to say that he's with a group of 10 to 15 other airmen who go into the forest, and they too see UFOs in the forest themselves. Again, another incident that is basically nobody is aware of. Nobody is aware of because nobody had ever heard of this before. So until he said it, absolutely new exclusive, which was brilliant. Adrian Bustinza also kind of did the same, because when he said that, yeah, there was a second landing, he then said to me, but it's not the whole night. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, it's another night of activity. And I said, you telling me you had another night of UFO activity? And he said, yes. And it's all there in the book. And it suggests that there was not that there may have been a fourth consecutive night of UFO activity, which is amazing because it stretches it out even more, because we were aware that there were generally 3 accepted consecutive nights of activity, but then you're having a new incident that's saying that looks like it's a 4th night. And the key thing is, whilst we'll never really be certain now, his recollection of it being another night is important. And I don't think 42 years down the line we can get too bogged down if people can't remember precise dates and times. The key thing is the testimony, and what they experience. It's very difficult for people all these years later to be absolutely certain. And don't forget, when we're dealing with a case like UFOs, normal rules go out the window. Sometimes people will say to me, well, they should have done this, that, the other. And I said, well, normally, normal rules, if it had been a police and say a murder on the camp, procedures would have been totally different. But when you're talking with UFOs, normal rules, procedures tend to go out the window. And I think that is what happens at Rendlesham. People have kind of tried to say that it was a kind of an organised go to the woods. It wasn't, based on many interviews I've done with military witnesses there. this was kind of a chaotic situation. People didn't really know what they were going into, and lots of people were being deployed. And one of the things that comes out in the book that I've not really talked about in any of the media sessions so far, and so it's kind of a bit of an exclusive for you on this show, is the fact that on at least one of the nights, but I suspect on several nights, on at least one of the nights, and I'm going to put it in simple terms because they use an expression, their mid shift actually refers to their midnight shift, a night shift. So it's confusing. So the way to look at it is, imagine you're working an afternoon shift from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. And then there's a night shift that will come on and replace you, that will come on at 11 o'clock and generally go off at 7 in the morning, an 8-hour shift. Well, what was established by at least 3 military witnesses that I spoke to is that the afternoon shift, instead of going off duty at 11 p.m., were held on and they did a double shift. Yeah. So if you imagine you have a normal shift on a nuclear base, is about 40 personnel. So there's things kicking off in the woods and around the bases. So things kicking off, you then, instead of letting those 40 go home, you then say, no, we need you to stay on duty because there's things happening. And so that then doubles it to about 80. So there'll be at least around 80 US Air Force security police officers and what was called law enforcement. Law enforcement, you had basically 2 types of policemen there. You had those that were wearing blue uniform, looking very smart, and they would be, in a sense, doing ordinary policing things. Say if there was a fight in one of the mess halls or something like that, or there was a drugs bust, they would be the people doing that. And they were called law enforcement. They were basically the police, if you think of it in those simple terms. However, the vast majority that were guarding nuclear weapons were wearing combat gear, looking like soldiers, if you the archetypal soldier in camouflage gear. And so there were far more of those. So we're talking maybe 80 security police officers in camouflage that were kept on duty, 2 shifts together, and maybe anywhere up to 12 to 24 law enforcement officers who were wearing kind of blue uniforms and were the policeman side, doing policing type jobs. And so that's a lot of people. And it's, and to get that confirmation from several people that the shifts were held over is important, because if you think about it, that's where some of the confusion about shifts may have come in, because people may have forgotten that they were held over and the shifts were running into each other. So you're basically talking the C shift running into the D shift, and yet they were actually kept on. So people's memories all these years later will have got a bit confused, because they think, well, I worked it, but I'm C shift, or I worked it because I'm D shift. And actually the reality is that they were kept on and both became the night shift of approximately 80 to 100, for want of a better word, security police officers. So that's important. And nobody had really brought that out before. And I think another thing that was really, that again, I've not talked about, that I've kind of saved for this show, is the fact that I spoke to at least 3 people have acknowledged that the various radio channels, there was one for sensor security control, there was one for law enforcement, and there was one actually for the nuclear weapons storage area, a security audio channel. So you've got various channels, and what was established through my research was that all the channels were routinely recorded on audio tape, reel-to-reel audio tapes. Remember, let's go back in time, pre-digital era. And if you remember, big organizations would often have the big reels of tape and they'd record things. And I remember that from my time in the Royal Air Force, and also my early time when I joined the police. They were recording things on reel-to-reel audio tapes. So all those channels were routinely recorded. Now, here we are all these years later, and there is a potential mine, there's a gold mine of information there if those audio tapes still exist. They probably still do exist, but unfortunately, we're never likely to see them, and because they're deemed too sensitive. And I think that's the real story, is that a lot of the good stuff has been taken away. We know that various radar stations had their in the locale of the area within a 20-40 mile radius of the twin bases, who monitored the air traffic tower at Bentwaters and Woodbridge. Their tapes were taken away, which, if you've read a lot of the UFO books about military cases in particular and pilot cases, people turn up and say, "Give us your tapes, never to be seen again." And that's kind of like what happened at Rendlesham. I've no doubt that the best evidence was taken away. And don't forget that if we start going back to what uh, Sergeant Adrian Bustinza told me, and what Larry Warren had already said all those years earlier in late 1982 when he first started to come forward, was that there was this second landing, and yet it had been so become really a mire of counter accusations and infighting, especially over the last 5 or 6 years, of which I experienced a lot of that from a certain group of trolls who basically, if you disagreed with them, they just called you all the names under the sun. Well, that's not research. If you have to resort to calling people and swearing at them and being abusive, then that's not research. And all the time, I knew that I'd had these interviews and I was sat on this information for a long time. And that was one of the reasons why I decided to bring the book out earlier than the film, is because, I did those interviews with Adrian Bustinza, 2021, Steve Longero, 2018, 19, 20. So you sat on really key information about new incidents, and that should be in the public domain. But in a sense, I felt responsible to wait for the film. But in the end, the years were passing by, and I thought, in the end, no, this information needs to come out now, because it should be in the public domain, and hence why the book's come out now. And I think everybody now sees that the book sets up the documentary very well, because people still will want to see these interviews, and they were refilmed after my interviews. That a lot of the people I put forward, I'd already interviewed, and then I would recommend them to the director, and then arrangements would be made for those people to be filmed. So what you'll see in the film will be entirely new interviews that are all glossy in 4K cinema quality. And so there's a lot to look forward from the film in terms of the aerial filming, special effects, the recreations. That should be brilliant. But yeah, in terms of the book, I've just mentioned a few things, but here's a good one for you that ties in with this very controversial second landing that's now being corroborated. That there is no more debate. And the person who actually corroborates it indirectly is Colonel Holt. I mean, yes, the Colonel Holt, who for 30, 40 years has said that Larry Warren wasn't there, that there was no mention of entities, aliens, or anything like that, that the base commander wasn't there. Well, when I did that deep down research, I spoke to a guy called Ray Boucher, who was a MUFON representative for the state of Nebraska. And his senator at the time, when he was doing, was Senator James Exxon, who's also served on the Armed Services Committee. And he, for 3 years, along with a colleague called Scott Colburn, who was MUFON as well, they did 3 years of research into Rendlesham. And I think they probably did the best early research into the case. And they spoke to a number of military witnesses, including Adrian Bustinza, including Larry Warren, including one or two other people. And one of the things that came out of it is that they approached Senator James Exxon and said, look, Senator, you might not be aware of this case, but it's very famous. And there's a lot of information on it, and it involves US Air Force servicemen. And they said, yeah, well, okay. He said, basically, bring me more information. And in the process of doing that, he'd been sent the Holt memorandum, and he basically still wasn't convinced. So Ray Boucher thought, I'm going to ring up Colonel Holt. Now, bear in mind, Colonel Holt is not retired at this point. Holt does not retire until 1991. So he rings him up in April of 1985, 6 years before his retirement. He's still serving, obviously. And he said, look, I've spoken to a number of witnesses, including Adrian Bustinza, including Larry Warren, and they tell me there's a second landing, that it's been filmed, it's been surrounded by US Air Force security police officers, it's been filmed, and that Colonel Williams was there, the base commander. And to that question, once he's laid out those circumstances, Ray Boucher wrote down Holt's verbatim reply, which was basically, yes, I can substantiate all of that. I can substantiate all of that for the senator, as in Senator James Exxon. And it was written down verbatim. So this was a direct admission while he was still serving, before he became this public personality that we see in all the documentaries. So this was 6 years before he retired. He was asked the question, was Colonel Williams there? Was there a second landing? Blah, blah. And was it filmed? And he said, yeah, I can verify all that for the centre. And for those people who are skeptical, who think, well, maybe it's ambiguous what he said, it's not, because when Ray Boucher went back to James Exxon and said, look, I've spoken to Holt, it then turns out that Senator Exxon has a meeting with Colonel Holt. And then after that, James Exxon doesn't want to speak to Ray Boucher ever again. So something was said. So Ray Boucher didn't want to let it go. So he wrote letter after letter laying out all the circumstances. On such and such a day, I spoke with Colonel Holt and I gave him all the circumstances, and he told me he could verify all of that for you as the senator. So there's no ambiguity in these. A couple of these letters are actually in the book at the back, and they're important because there's no ambiguity whatsoever. Holt had admitted before he retired, before he became this public personality, that there had been this second landing. So all the years that have followed where he's saying, nah, Colonel Williams wasn't there, blah, blah, blah. And here's an interesting thing as well, and I don't think I've put this into the context before in a show about the book, is a few years ago, I spoke with Grant Cameron, who's obviously very well known in the field, Canadian researcher. And he was telling me about that he'd become aware of a study of former, mostly military people, who'd possibly suffered health effects from being in close proximity to UFOs. And obviously, people may be aware that John Burroughs had health issues, Jim Penniston had health issues, Larry Warren had health issues. It turns out that Adrian Bustinza had health issues for being close proximity. But one of the things that comes out is that these people, some of which were being interviewed by a former CIA doctor called Kit Green. And Grant Cameron told me that he believed at least 3 Rendlesham witnesses had been interviewed about possible injuries by being in close proximity to UFOs. And I said, who were the 3 people? And he went, John Burroughs, Jim Penniston, and Colonel Williams. Oh, Colonel Williams, the base commander, who'd never been near the scene? Well, that just nicely follows on, doesn't it? That there he was, he'd been in close, and the story goes that Colonel Williams, the base commander of 12,000 personnel, had been within 6 to 10 feet of 3 floating entities and had some kind of silent face-off. And all of this was filmed, not on still photographs, but on motion picture footage. And again, there's another quote by Captain Mark Verano, who went on the record twice. Once for the famous CNN documentary in 1985, and he's in silhouette, but he says, yes, I picked up Colonel Williams from the scene of the second landing and drove him to a fighter jet that was waiting at Harry Bentwaters, and he was carrying like a pouch, a top secret pouch, and Captain Mike Morano said to the base commander, Colonel, what's in the pouch? And he said, motion picture footage of the UFO. Again, this all is adding corroboration to this story. So not only do you have Holt admission 6 years before he retired, you've got now corroborated testimony from Adrian Bustinza. He's the key witness to come forward, and he was a sergeant, and he basically just saying it's on another night of activity that he'd been involved in, 2 nights he'd experienced, but Colonel Williams was there, that it was being filmed, it was being surrounded by security police officers, blah, blah, blah. And he said that Holt was there as well, did Adrian Bustinza. So really interesting testimony. And what I would say is that in the short time we've got, and I know that you'll have some questions for me, that the things that I raise in this book, I guarantee you that most people will have not known about them, and it will be seen as a lot of new revelations. And so it's not just another book. I really go and get a lot of new information, both old and new. I had a new witness come forward. Now, in the book, he's listed as as one of the in the conclusion as one of 18 incidents over broken down, timed incidents. That in my conclusion, I said that the UFO incidents, that's why I call it UFO incidents, because I said that there were 18. Well, since the book's launch, one of the people that's in it, called James Stewart, who was not a security police officer, sensational tale. He came back to me after the book's release and he said, look, I've been checking my military records, and actually I left the base in early 1980. So my incident, which he thought was late December 1980, was actually late December 1979. So instead of 18 incidents in the cluster at the end of December, we're now looking at 17. But again, James Stewart was fixing an aircraft, and basically, cutting a long story short, because I know you'll have questions, there were potential 2 entities seen. There were shots fired by a security police officer at the East Gate, possible abductions going on, and he saw landing UFO. So that's cutting a long story short. But there is some sensational things that I feel very privileged to have received. And I just wanted to slip the book out. There was no pre-publicity with the book whatsoever, and that was done deliberate, because I know that in certain quarters there will be opposition from certain people within the UFO field. And so I wanted to get the information out, because what I figured was that once the genie is out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. And I really literally just one day, well, as soon as it was finished and it was checked and proved, let's get it out there. Obviously now it's out. It's garnering universal really good reviews, so I'm really lucky, and I now probably will seek to find a mainstream publisher in the hope that they can promote it in ways that I can't, because I don't have that reach. But yeah, that's basically how there's lots of new and old information, new interviews, new re-interviews, and there's a lot of material in there I guarantee you will have not read. So I'll hand you back now, Astrid, if you've got a question.
Yeah, okay. It seems like this is a case who is growing rapidly from year to year. You're saying 18 incidents.
Now 17. Now 17 in that late December cluster. 17.
From we once believed 1 or 2, at most 3. Now it's 17. Wow.
17 different events, all at different times, over at least 3 consecutive days of activity. I now suspect it's 4 nights of consecutive activity. So yeah, because what I do is I break them down. If there's a time difference, it's a new incident. It's not the same incident. If there's a time difference and you lose sight of witnesses for 2 hours and then something else happens, that's another incident. Yes, it's all part of a cluster of incidents, but it's actually another sighting, because you can't guarantee that what you saw 2 hours previously is the same thing you're looking at now. And often there were different shapes seen. You know, some people saw glowing beach ball size objects, red, glowing orange, that like dripped molten metal, but nothing was ever found. Then there were triangles seen, a landed black triangular, a shimmering craft on a second landing, entities seen on at least 2 occasions, abduction, missing time on at least 2 occasions that's established in the book. So there's a whole host of things. And actually there's an incident in there that, again, a guy, an airman called Steve Wagner, he again had never really gone on the record. He'd mentioned it briefly on his Facebook page, but nobody really gone back to him. When I spoke to him, he then alludes to another incident that occurred, according to him, on the 23rd of December. So just before the accepted cluster of incidents. And he said he was called to the East Gate because a security policeman had reported something going into the forest, but much closer to the East Gate, maybe on 150 feet away, 50 yards away from that East Gate, which is not in the position it's in now. It's set back another 40, 50 meters. And he basically said that something had landed behind a cluster of trees. Well, when he went to investigate with another airman, they found three triangular or 3 indentations in a perfect triangle in a clearing near to the East Gate. But these depressions, guess how big these were? These weren't 9 inches like the original Penniston and Burroughs landing impressions. Each depression was about 5 feet wide. Wow.
Wow.
So again, an entirely new set of depressions that can't be accounted for. So really, there's a whole host of things, but we'll be here all day.
So what do you reckon? I know that the Woodbridge and Bentwaters were if I don't know if they still are, but at that time it was a nuclear weapon based area, and that could be a part of explanation for the UFO activity. But do you think that that's the only reason? It occurs to me that there's something else.
I don't know. One thing that I think I've come to realize over the last 10 years or so, and I used to dismiss it, is the idea that there may be portals, some of areas, vortexes, whatever you want to call them, strange areas, basically. And I can account for when I'm filming in the forest as part of the documentary, and there are other incidents occurred, but that'll be for the film to show. But it was definitely a strange place, and I mentioned it to you briefly in the run up to the show. I saw something. I don't think I've ever mentioned it on a show before. But as I was doing some private filming, walking across the farmer's field, I think it was about 2010. I was then with my fiance. We'd crossed the farmer's field that we talk about, Capel Green as it's referred to, and we'd gone from the wood side over to the farmhouse side. We'd done some filming of the lighthouse in the distance just to get nighttime shot. And then as we were walking back across the open farmer's field by the side of the farmhouse, literally just as we'd entered the field, and my then fiance didn't see it, but I saw very briefly from the forest side ahead of me, across the other side of the field, I saw what I can only describe as a cobalt blue flame coming towards me down at an angle into the forest. A couple of seconds, 2-3 seconds at most, but no noise, but it was like, it was really weird, the color. As much as anything, I'll never forget that really intense blue color, which some people have referred to in terms of the sightings of the UFO was this cobalt blue, really kind of electric blue. And so I don't know what that was, but I saw it briefly. I've no doubts it actually happened, and I've never seen anything like it before or since. So I do think Rendlesham is a strange place, and I don't know why that is, but I do think it's a strange place, and whether it's a portal or whatever, I'm far more open to that possibility now, especially when you start talking about what we're learning about from the Skinwalker Ranch, and that there's the paranormal stroke UFO related strange occurrences. It's as if there are certain areas where things can emerge.
Mhm.
Quite what they are, we don't know. But do I think that there are maybe things, portals now? Yeah, I do. I'm open to that idea. And I can certainly see that in Rendlesham, lots and lots of people have experienced strange things. And, I think it's still, to this day, it's an area of strangeness. And in fact, I'll tell the story of UFO Denmark. A few years ago, I took, I think, 7 or 8 Danish people from UFO Denmark on a little tour of Rendlesham. And one night, I took them to the far edge of the farmer's field, and I think it would be pretty much dusk time. And I think 3 of them went for a walk along this little footpath that runs alongside of the farmer's field. I stayed by the car, so I was the horse and driver, but they were basically just going for a little stroll. And then some 10 minutes later, literally all 3 of them came running out, looking very scared. And I think you can attest to this yourself, Astrid, that you've heard the stories from your colleagues, that they'd seen some strange lights in the forest, just along that footpath. Objects, I think, that, if I remember rightly, lights were seen that then dropped to the ground from like the trees, and absolutely scared them. And they all came running out, and there were. I remember one of them was almost in tears. He was so shook up by it, and who wouldn't be? But yes, so I've no doubt that there are still strange things happening in the forest. It's a kind of a unique place in the UK.
So spooky as well as beautiful experiences. Is the
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. Okay, Gary. I think we're going to take some questions from our members. We have one here. We have heard from other cases that the beam from UFOs had made the weapons unusual. Do you know if that was the case at Rendlesham?
There was we now have a named witness. Airman Steve Longero gave direct testimony to me to say that he was inside the nuclear weapons storage area, walking around on the ground with an experienced airman when they saw a UFO at the edge of the weapons storage area above the forest that then shone a beam down into the nuclear weapons storage bunker. And it's called a hot row. It's just got one long row, approximately 200 meters long, with several bunkers, and it's what's underneath. Uh, and uh, and the object did this, shone a beam that was scanning the bunkers like this in a pendulum fashion all the way down, as if it was scanning what was in each of the bunkers. Quite what it was doing, it suggests a scan. Now, you mentioned nuclear weapons aspect. I think the whole case is about nuclear weapons. I've said it for a long time, actually before I wrote the book, because when I first met Holt in 2007, on the very first night that I met him, we were socialized for about 3 hours. We worked on film, just getting to know him. I was very excited to meet him, and he told me that there were more nuclear weapons underground at RAF Bentwaters than anywhere else in Europe. Now, it was a nuclear base. I've got documentation in the book that says it's a nuclear base. However, it was the amount of nuclear weapons. If you imagine if you had a stockpile of maybe 10 or 25 that were published in the records, and that's what the book says, that there were 25 nuclear weapons. What if there were 500 weapons? He never was specific, but I suspect that UFOs turn up at Rendlesham at a time of nuclear crisis. And it was a nuclear crisis because a lot of people don't realise the context of Rendlesham. At the time it occurred, it was late December 1980. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were massing on the borders of Poland. Poland was still a Soviet country, Soviet state, and there was an uprising led by Lech Wałęsa, the Polish shipyard workers in Gdansk. And at the time of Rendlesham, all the thousands of troops, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops, were looking like they were going to roll in the tanks and put down this rebellion like they had done in Hungary and Czechoslovakia in years gone by. So that's one tension. So bear in mind that Bentwaters and Woodbridge was the top strike base in the UK. It was the top strike base for Soviet aggression. Yeah. And so that, and then there's another world event that's a real powder cake. There were 52 Americans being held hostage by the Iranians. So that became the Iranian hostage crisis that had gone on for months. So you've got a powder keg in the Middle East and a powder keg on the Polish borders, potential Third World War scenario. And I think that's why UFOs turn up, because in some kind of way, we know through observations of UFOs near nuclear weapons power plants for over 80 years now, back to the 40s, that there's this long correlation between UFOs being seen near nuclear installations, that they have an interest, whatever it is, we don't know, but they clearly have an interest. And I think that they turn up at a time of world crisis because of the amount of nuclear weapons that were being illegally stored. In my opinion, I can't prove it. Then the British, the Americans are never going to admit that they broke the armament agreements, but I speculate that's why they were there.
That makes a good segue to the next question. Have you heard of UFO incidents in Rendlesham after 1980, 1981? Not, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but these are not, as far as I'm aware, these are not military cases, but there are lots of people who've had sightings that to this day, people are still reporting sightings, but not in the same way. And bear in mind that the twin bases are closed now and have been for several years now. So, but yeah, I spoke to a number of people during the filming of Capel Green who had experiences. I spoke to a family that lived, two children that lived very close to the East Gate, and they'd had experiences as well. But that's all for the documentary. I wanted to focus on that late December period, but what's also important, and I've not mentioned it yet, is there were a number of what's called precursor cases, important UFO military cases that occurred at the twin bases in the run up to December. So what, to a skeptic and the way that the media present this stuff, it's like, oh, it was the lighthouse. It was rubbish from the beginning. The lighthouse theory was only ever became a part of the story because of the media. It was only the media that pushed it, and they are complicit in playing this case down, in my opinion, because it makes no sense. Holt said straight away, no, lighthouses don't move. But that didn't matter. Once the story got in there, it still to this day gets talked about because of the way the subject is presented, and they want to try to dumb it down and make it sound silly. Well, it's not. And the lighthouse was never a factor from day one, but the media created it, and unfortunately, the documentaries that were made that followed in the decades since, they've all mentioned the lighthouse. Were they confused by the lights of the lighthouse? The lighthouse didn't even send a beam inward to land. It had a metal screen. It could flash outwards to the sea because it's a lighthouse for basically sea ships. But inwardly, there was no sweeping beam came in. All you saw was a brief flash every 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, boom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, boom. And that was it. But all the documentaries still talk about it, and that's no coincidence. So for my mind, and I actually say it in the book, that I believe that the media at the highest levels were told to stay and play down this case, and they did so. Whether it was a D notice, we'll never know. But the media and the government, the US government, the British military, the American military, have all done their best to try to downplay what really occurred there because of the gravity of actually what did occur there. Because if it had come out with all these real stories coming out and what was seen, and had it been reported accurately, we may well have had a disclosure kind of situation 20, 30, 40 years ago. And they weren't ready for that. So I think that's why it was played down.
Yeah, the lighthouse came in handy in their agenda, you could say. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Okay, we have a question here. Did some of the witnesses get telepathic messages from the entities, and were the entities humanoid?
Well, the two people that have mentioned entities are Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, who referred to them as silhouettes, uh, because he was very uncomfortable. He was religious. It didn't sit well with what he'd seen, and he suffered a lot of nightmares, post-trauma, etc. Felt very uncomfortable by the idea of aliens or anything like that. And the other person was Larry Warren, who described earlier these three floating entities. Well, the best description of the entities is Larry Warren's. Larry Warren would say that when there's a shimmering craft, the second landing in the farmer's field, there is what he describes as like a bubble slips off the shimmering craft, not through a doorway, not through a window or anything like that. It basically, a bubble slips off the side of the craft, and the bubble then divides into three bubbles. So if you can imagine three bubbles all next to each other, floating a few feet off the ground, and within each of the bubbles was the upper torso of a humanoid figure, that wasn't humanoid as in the fact that a head and two arms, but very thin body, very pale, and they've often been described as like ghosts, very pale skin, but they were wearing some kind of upper uniform, um, big eyes, typical small grey, if we look at it in those senses, if you can imagine that, but wearing some kind of uniform, and the upper torso. And this is where famously Colonel Williams has this silent face off. There's no talk heard. Larry Warren doesn't hear talk. Neither does Adrian Bustinza, but basically there's this silent face off. You presume it's some kind of telepathic message. The other time is when Sergeant Adrian Bustinza has an experience with John Burroughs. If you remember what's referred to as the Holt night, basically Holt leading a small team out, they go out for 4.5 hours, see UFOs, and then they come back to where all the vehicles were, which is called the staging area. When they come back there, basically John Burroughs is waiting, and he's saying, "Can I go back out there?" And Holt's originally saying no, and then he eventually does agree to let John Burroughs go back out. They've just come back in his small group, and then he goes out and he says, "Can I take Sergeant Bustinza with me?" And Bustinza goes with him. Now, here's an interesting thing from they don't go into the field. They think it's near the field, on a pathway near the field. It's never really specified exactly where, but I think it's probably close to the forest and a field. But anyway, interesting thing is that according to uh, Adrian Bustinza, John Burroughs is walking a few meters ahead of him, and then suddenly Adrian Bustinza, who was walking behind him, feels as if somebody has pushed him to the ground. He feels a force from behind that knocks him down to the ground, and he falls to his knees. And as he falls to his knees, he looks forward, and John is suddenly then engulfed in incredibly bright white light. And as he's looking forward at John, Adrian Bustinza, in unique testament to me, said, "I saw some kind of figure to the left of John, who's like 6'6", built like an outhouse. So I some smaller figure to his left side, John in the middle, and I could also see some kind of silhouetted figure to the right side." Now, here's the thing. From Adrian Bustinza's point of view, he and John were gone for 10 minutes, and then they went back after that experience, back to the staging area and back to Holt. However, when they got back, Colonel Holt was angry at them. "Where have you been? You've been gone for 40 minutes. So they, in their own mind, had only been gone for 10 minutes. But according to Holt, it was around 40 minutes. So again, you've got this missing time aspect. And so missing time, so maybe they were abducted. It's a very real possibility. And the interesting thing is, I think that John Burroughs, Laurie Warren, Adrian Bustinza, Steve Longero, they can't remember how they get back to their They don't remember what happens after they've been in the forest. They don't remember how they got back to their dormitories where they lived. They all struggle with that, but the incidents are all there. But don't forget, all those people were interrogated, especially Jim Penniston interrogated. Adrian Bustinza was given an horrendous time, and when I interview him on two occasions. The first time is a 4.5 hour transatlantic call, and then I do a 75-minute Skype video. So he's on video, which will come out in film, and he talks about his chilling experience of being interrogated by what we think is the Office of Special Investigations, OSI, being given a hard time, being threatened with his life. And in the book, it's almost palpable the fear that he experiences, and he felt disgusted that as a sergeant he was being treated like a criminal. It made him actually even contemplate going AWOL, absent without leave, running away from the Air Force, because he was so disgusted at the way he's being treated just because he saw something. And in the book, it's a really powerful, if not the most powerful sequence in the entire book, because he's just relaying it out, and I'm not interrupting him, and it's palpable, the fear. And his family were being surveilled by agents in the United States. His dad worked for the government. There were people watching his house. So if we go back to the quirk of the lighthouse, that's a hell of a lot of things to do if it's just a lighthouse.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Okay, let's take another question. With what is happening in Ukraine, where we have ended up in a kind of Cold War, do you believe, based on Robert Saller's experiences back in 1967
Yeah.
at the Malmstrom base in Montana, and what happened in Rendlesham several times back in the 80s, 1980, that advanced life from other solar systems or people from the future who have traveled back, that it is even possible that a nuclear war can happen on Earth. Will it not be prevented?
Uh,
That.
there's a lot in that. Basically, from my point of view, what do I think that the 17 different events were? I think, based on the description by the witnesses, not one of those 17 different incidents can be explained in conventional terms. You apply normal rationale. Is it a plane? Is it a helicopter? Is it misidentification? None of them apply, because most were all seen at close proximity. Now, if it's close, you can't get it wrong. If you're walking around a small triangular object 3 meters by 3 meters that's on the ground, and it's glass-like, and it's black, and it's emitting colours in a small clearing, that you can't get really any closer than that. So to suggest that that was a lighthouse is kind of ludicrous. None of those matched anything like a lighthouse. That was always a ludicrous answer. All the objects seen moved under intelligent control. People will say, was it a psyop? I don't believe it's a psyop for 1 minute, not with live rounds. Some of the airmen, even though most handed their weapons over when they went out to the forest, were live armed. Some, on one occasion, a Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin was run off the road by a UFO that basically followed her at hedgerow height. She crashed a vehicle into a ditch, and when she climbed out of the rolled vehicle, we haven't even talked about this, but it's a major story. When she climbed out of the vehicle, the UFO, this ball of orangey red light, was still hovering close to her. She was so terrified, she fired her weapon at it and discharged several rounds at it, and then that shot away. So when you've got those kind of incidents and that close proximity, don't for a minute think that it's anything else that I think is points to what I think is a non-human intelligence. Hence why the book is called Non-Human. Now, I think it's probably extraterrestrial, but we know now from the latest research that we're dealing with some kind of non-human intelligence, whether it's extraterrestrial, whether it's interdimensional, ultra-terrestrial, something like that. We really don't know, but I think we're dealing with something that's non-human, and hence why I call the book Non-Human.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that they will sort of go into
Would they stepping in a nuclear war environment?
yeah, yeah.
Uh, I suspect they wouldn't. But what you've got to understand is, and I often say it, is that we only know 10% about UFO reality in the public domain. 90% of it lies under the secret veil of intelligence agencies and governments, and we don't have the necessary need to know. So I don't. Are we approaching a kind of a disclosure? Yes, I think we are. Um, I'm involved at the highest levels, talking to very senior people, and and I think something genuinely is happening, and I think it. I wouldn't be surprised if something had happened that we're not aware of, that's known to high-level government officials, especially in the States, that is driving this change of legislation, getting, where we bring in the UAP topic into mainstream much more. I think there's maybe a driver, there's something going on, or maybe something has happened, or something is impending, and I think it's now part of the agenda now to get this out there. I think that within 3 to 5 years, we're going to have a full admission that there is a non-human intelligence interacting with planet Earth. Whether they reveal much more beyond that, probably not, to be honest. But do I think that it's going to become universally acknowledged that we are being interacted with? Then I think yes, and I think technology is at the heart of it, because all the ships now have got new radars and sensor facilities, and they're picking up these things left, right, and centre in a way that they couldn't do before. We know that the US has already admitted that things are flying around. Some people, and indeed the press, I think, want to believe that it's foreign adversary, and a small proportion might be Russian, Chinese, but by the way that the majority of these things move in ways that we can't understand, and with such velocities and g-forces that we can't replicate, I think we are dealing with something that's extraterrestrial. And I think if you then go down the line of the contact experience, which has gone on for decades, that the way those millions of people talk about interactions with different species, then for me it seems obvious that we're dealing with an extraterrestrial number of species who will come in here. Quite why, we don't know. But like I say, we only know 10%, 90% is secret. But I don't think, even if we had disclosure, big disclosure with a big D as they call it, tomorrow, I don't think America, for example, who's controlled this subject since the 1940s, I don't think they're going to really tell us all the research that they've done. They will just give us the tip of the iceberg, and I think it will get to the stage where they'll just say we are dealing with objects that aren't foreign adversary. And I think it'll be this slow process of elimination, and I think they'll eventually accept that we're dealing with something that they can't explain, that it is real, and that there is an intelligence behind it. And that's when you get big disclosure. But they won't reveal everything to us. What if there's been contact, what secret research, whether there's any craft recovered, I doubt very much.
At that time, the word D-Day will have a totally different meaning.
Absolutely. The good news is that in some ways that everybody acknowledges that as and when and if that contact is universally acknowledged, i.e., everybody on the planet is told about it, that will be the most profound moment in human history. And so for me, that's one of the drivers why I got involved in this subject, because for me, it has the potential to be the most exciting thing in the world, because it will affect mankind in a way that we've never seen before. And it will answer some questions, but throw up so many more questions. What is our place in the universe? Would we gain technology? Would it be used for good purposes? Could you travel? Would free energy, that kind of thing? It throws up lots of different things, but I do think something is happening. I suspect something is powering it, but I do think within the next 3 to 5 years we'll get that kind of disclosure. So it's not, the whole world knows. And I don't think we're that far off now. And if you listen to people like Russ Coulthart, who, if you think about the famous award-winning Australian journalist, he 2 years ago, 3 years ago, had no interest in the subject. And he then has literally stumbled onto it, done some research. And the more he's researched, the more he has realized how real it is. He then wrote a great book, Hide in Plain Sight, best-selling book. And he's now one of the leading people saying, this is going to happen. And he's talking to high-level people like I am. And he's talking to high-level people because he's a top journalist. And they are telling him that something is coming and may only be months away. There are several people out there, prominent people, who say something may happen this year. And we, you get frustrated sometimes because we all saw the recent congressional hearing with Sean Kirkpatrick, and that was very dour, very cautious, didn't really address some of the key things like the tic tac validity and whatever. So it was very underwhelming. But I suspect that might be for a reason, because until they get all the information that they absolutely need, they're going to keep it really coy. But we know now from things that were disclosed there, he said 24 witnesses have now given testimony to the RO office, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. That's fantastic. So these are probably the likes of Robert Salas. We know he's gone on record, and others, former military people who've given their accounts. That's good. Now, what is the point of these former people, witnesses, whistleblowers, for want of a better word, giving their testimony if they're not going to do anything with it? And I think that has to be going somewhere. And they're now saying, just in recent days, 6 of those 24 are high-level senior people within black budget programs who've maybe worked on recovered crashed retrieval UFOs. So it's indicating that it's good. This information is must be there for some reason, and I think people are already speculating by the end of this year there will be public witness hearings through the whistleblower amendment that was signed off in 2022 by President Biden. So I think when you look at it in that context, we're close, because I do think that if you get the likes of Robert Salas giving open testimony about nuclear missile shutdowns, like in his case, Malmstrom 67, and other US bases being shut down, nuclear weapons, I think if that was being filmed live, the press would have to report on it. And I think that would be the key thing. At the moment, like if you saw Sean Kirkpatrick, he looked very uncomfortable. He was very tight-lipped. And he was, and the one thing that he said, there's no evidence yet to say it's extraterrestrial, basically is a paraphrase. And that is the key line that the press immediately, nothing to see here, not aliens, not aliens. Well, imagine if we're that much closer now to another witness congressional hearing, and everything the witnesses are going to say are going to be the complete opposite to what Kirkpatrick's stance was. So it's like, no, we think, what do you think this was? Well, I think this was not from this earth. And you'll get countless witnesses saying this, and it can't be explained away in conventional man-made terms. So I think when that happens, that's going to be very interesting, because the press are going to have to have a real dilemma. Do they keep trying to bury their heads in the sand, or are they finally going to say, fair enough, we'll take this seriously? And a lot of, I've been saying this for over 10 years, that I describe it as like a brick in the wall. For every, you've got a dam, and you lose a brick out the inside of the wall that's facing the water. So it creates a bit more pressure on that center point of the dam. And then another brick goes, and there's more pressure building in the center of that wall. Well, eventually it's like a house of cards. Eventually the pressure will become too great, and then there will be a collapse. And so I think that when we do get at that point of mass disclosure, it will be like an avalanche. It will be a dam breaking, and then suddenly the whole world will never be the same. It will be like a terrorist incident where it's 24/7, every news channel covering this subject. That's when you know you've got disclosure. When every news channel, a bit like COVID, when that happened, and it's 24/7 on every channel, whatever your thoughts on COVID, when it's on every channel, that's when you know you're dealing with something on a world stage. So I think that's when you'll know disclosure's happened, when it's on relentlessly. It's a bit like in the UK now. We've just had the coronation, every news channel, 3 days, 4 days, wall to wall. It's the coronation. You can't miss it. It'll be like that when disclosure happens. It'll be wall to wall.
Unless we have a false flag before
Hell
that.
of a false flag, Astrid,
The
on a
question, yeah,
gigantic scale. But
yeah,
maybe we will. I don't take it for granted because they've managed to keep this secret for 75 years. But I do think it's getting harder through technology to keep it. And I think the people that were old have retired, and much younger people are now there who are far more probably open to the idea of ET and other races and life in space. So I think it's a mass changeover period, and I think there are so many military people ready to come forward. In fact, I saw an interview today. Ryan Graves, the former military pilot, he was saying that he knows of 50, 60 other pilots who are ready to give evidence, should this kind of break even further. But everybody's, concerned, and the whistleblower thing is just coming in. But I think it's tip of an iceberg. And I think once there are public hearings, I think you'll be teetering on the edge then, because I really don't see how they can cover it up for much longer.
Okay, let's take the last question. Do you have any plans of doing an audiobook of Non-Human?
What, with where I do it or I get somebody to read it? I don't know. I've not. One or two people have asked me. It's not something I really thought. Some people have asked for an ebook, and my initial thought was, I'm a bit of a traditionalist given my age. I want it. That's a book to me. An ebook is not the same as physically holding your own creation, and that was a big moment, obviously, I think, for any new author, and that's my first book, and that was a beautiful moment to finally hold your book when it was printed. Perhaps in time there'll be an ebook. Whether there'll be an audio book, I kind of like the idea of narrating an audio book. Maybe that's something that I'll look at.
Okay, Gary, we're running out of time now. So let me ask you before we wrap this up. Do you think that we will ever get to the bottom of what really happened in Rendlesham Forest?
Probably not. Probably not. But I suspect that the case is very highly thought of in reality behind the scenes. I think, in fact, I know it is because I've talked to some very senior people in the field, and I know it's highly regarded. They know it's not a lighthouse and that it's probably ET related, non-human. They know it's non-human, put it that way. So I think the answer is we'll probably know everything that not know everything. I think if we kind of get a disclosure soon, more witnesses from Rendlesham will come forward. I'm certain there are many more witnesses who are airmen who were involved at Rendlesham. They need to come forward as well, and some have never gone on the record, like Lieutenant Bruce England, Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin. Her story's in the book, but it's a part witness story by another airman called Michael Stacey Smith. But Bonnie Tamplin, Lieutenant England, they've never gone on the record. Bobby Ball was a key witness, Captain Mike Morano. I'd love for these people, if they're listening, to contact me, especially, and that's one of the reasons I write the book, and I make that plea to them. I hope you'll come forward so that I can interview you and get your testimony, in a sense, before it's too late. Because if you think of Rendlesham, everybody's sadly passed away, and time is against us now. As with every year that passes with Rendlesham, and it's such an important case. Most people regard it as the second most famous case in history, so we need to preserve it as best we can.
Okay, Gary, it's been a pleasure having you on the show today and fascinating to hear about your research. Thank you so much for being with us today and good
It's
luck.
out on Amazon. Don't forget, it's out on Amazon. Ships within 48 hours. If you haven't got it, get it, because you will be amazed at what's in it. And I'm not just saying that because I'm the author. Most people are saying I'm amazed at how much information you've got.
And I can recommend it too. So,
Thank you very much, Astrid. I'll pay you later.
thank you very much, Gary.
Thank you.